Here, so I will be starting right now with my introduction. Hello everyone, my name is Natalie Gevorgian and I would like to welcome you to the Winter 2021 George E. Danis Eastern Mediterranean Security and Diplomacy Seminar. The EC Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, in cooperation with the Konstantin G. Karamanlis Chair at the Fletcher School, the Fletcher Initiative on Religion, Law and Diplomacy, the Department of International Relations at the National University of Political Studies, Public Administration in Romania, and the Institute of International Relations in Athens will be hosting a one-week program of focused lectures, presentations, and panel discussions. The one-week program will bring experts from different regions in 3 sets of presentations and panel discussions aimed at assessing a changing America and a dynamic Eastern Mediterranean. The seminar will address the multifaceted intersectional issues that explain the significance of the Eastern Mediterranean in regional, trans-regional, and global terms by considering issues such as climate change, migration, energy, resources and security, religio-cultural identities and soft power, public health pandemics, and inter and interstate relations, with country experts from the cases across the Mediterranean basin, the Middle East and the Caucasus, and the transatlantic space. The seminar will introduce students to the historically grounded significance of the Eastern Mediterranean for contemporary U.S. foreign and security policy and for key global trends in the 21st century. Our presenters this week come from different countries of the region, as well as backgrounds. We have a mixture of policymakers, diplomats, and academics. The full program is available once you register for the conference. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Vasileia Digidiki, who is a social and forensic psychologist and a health and human rights fellow at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University. She leads the center's research on refugee and migrant child protection in the Mediterranean basin, with a special focus on sexual exploitation of refugee and migrant children. And our second speaker is Ms. Katerina Voutsina, who is a data journalist and communications professional with international organizations. She is currently leading the communication and engagement strategy for Pharos.org, a humanitarian organization based in Greece that focuses on the protection of unaccompanied refugee minors. Prior to her role, she was a research fellow at the Edward R. Murrow Center at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and a journalist for the Wall Street Journal, U.S. News and World Report, and Greek daily newspapers. Our third speaker today is Ms.Ahsen Utku, who holds a dual master's degree from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and Harvard Divinity School, and is currently a PhD candidate at the Political Science Department at Northeastern University. Her research focuses on ethno-religious and national conflict, identity politics, minorities and marginalized groups, citizenship, and forced migration. Ms. Utku has also worked for several nonprofit organizations, and she still volunteers with different organizations. And our fourth speaker who will hopefully join us today is Mr. Sridhar Nemani, who is a PhD student at the Klein College of Media and Communication at Temple University. Prior to joining Temple University, he was affiliated with the Edward R. Murrow Center for Digital Age at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University as a research fellow. His research interests are in the intersections of media, communities, and technology, and he has conducted ethnographic fieldwork in India and Greece. And I would also like to introduce our facilitator today, Dr. Prodromou, who is a faculty member at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where she directs the initiative on religion, law, and diplomacy. And before turning the microphone to our speaker, I wanted to let you know that Dr. Prodromou will act as the facilitator of the event and will guide the Q&A, which will follow the 45-minute presentation. The duration of our program will be 1 hour and 30 minutes. I'd like to ask you to turn off your microphones and to use either the chat or raise your hand for questions. We will try to answer all of the questions. It is nice to have you all here, and thank you for being here with us today.
Great, thank you, Natalie, for starting us out this afternoon, and thank you everyone to being with us. And as always, thank you to the benefactor of the program, Mr. Danis, for your vision and your commitment to exploring this week's theme of security and diplomacy in the Mediterranean and Europe. I'm shortening our title, but that's what we've been looking at. And it's really especially a pleasure to introduce and be part of this afternoon's panel, since not only do we have a Fletcher contingent here, but we also have our Harvard contingent, and all of us have worked together in some way, shape, or form on 2 projects dealing with migration, the migration phenomenon, with the Eastern Mediterranean as a kind of fulcrum for looking at the migration phenomenon. So 2 separate projects, one working on migration information networks and the other looking at migration, religion, and security, and you'll hear all about that. I wanted to say one quick word about the title of the noon seminar, the 11 a.m. seminar, excuse me, and now our 2 p.m. seminar moving forward, which is Wicked Challenges, Old and New Security Issues in the Eastern Med. And I wanted to say a little bit about wickedness and the term itself and why it's, I think, useful for us as a heuristic device in thinking about the migration phenomenon in particular. And the notion of wickedness as an analytic and conceptual category actually has its roots in complexity theory and in chaos theory. So for those of you who work on theories of change, you'll recognize the term from there. But it's been more broadly applied. Strategic consultants think about wickedness in terms of institutional analysis and design and resilience. And then people who work on, experts who work on migration, climate disruption, pandemics, also apply the concept of wickedness to analyzing and also to developing durable policy solutions. So in terms of our panel today, when we think about wickedness, wicked problems are problems that don't have a single cause. They don't have a single solution. There's oftentimes no way to test the solution to wicked problems. In fact, there are multiple solutions to problems that are considered wicked precisely because they emerge from the intersectionality of and the interconnectedness of diverse and sometimes obvious, but other times less obvious causes. Wicked problems in that regard are in some ways essentially unique. They're all sui generis. It's very difficult to identify patterns and comparisons across wicked problems. And wicked problems, by definition, have multiple stakeholders in terms of designing and developing durable and resilient solutions. And resilience is one of the ways that we do indeed try to test the outcomes and the solutions for wicked problems. The other key dimension of wickedness when it comes to migration, I think you'll recognize this as well, is that wicked problems adapt to solutions. So they're constantly adapting. So this is why we talk about wicked problems as phenomena rather than as problems which imply cause, effect, input, output, and final solution. These are phenomena that are continually adapting. So in some ways, multi-stakeholder management, innovative responses are the ways that we think about wickedness. And migration, which we have heard a lot about in the media, which defined as a problem, or the migration problem, or the migration crisis. Migration is a globalized phenomenon. And it's, if we historicize it, it has deepest historical roots, and we're simply seeing the present incarnation of the migration phenomenon. So our 4 experts, hopefully 4, but at least 3 of us, 3 of you will be with us today. We'll be talking about migration, religion, security, and information networks within this context of wickedness. So I turn it over to Professor Digidiki. Our order will be Professor Digidiki, Ms. Voutsina, and then Ms. Utku, soon to be Dr. Utku as well. Okay, so take it away and welcome to all of you.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Professor Prodromou and Natalie. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I would like to wish everyone a happy new year full of health and joy and less pain. It seems that 2021 did not begin on the best way for democracy, but let's remain positive and hopeful that this will be a year of peace, both in the US and across the world. It is a great pleasure for me to be here today and for the opportunity to discuss how the phenomenon of migration unfolds in the Eastern Mediterranean region and how it evolves in a continuously changing policy environment. As Natalie previously mentioned, for the past 10 years, I have studied refugee rights and the intersection between human trafficking and forced displacement during different humanitarian crises across the world. However, the migration crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Greece specifically is of unique interest to me, both scientifically and personally, as I have experienced it, studied it, and witnessed it from three different angles: that of the researcher, the first responder, and the local, as I'm a native of the island of Lesbos, that small Greek island that not only has seen more than 500,000 migrants crossing through since 2015, but also the island that has become the testing ground for new, successful and unsuccessful European migration policies to halt the flows. And in this context, I have also researched the impact of the influx on the local communities and those factors that can lead to xenophobia and the destruction of humanitarian empathy. So today I will try to bring on the table the experience from the ground. And given that I have only 10 minutes, I would like to raise two main points very relevant to the phenomenon of migration and its attempted solutions in the region. The first point has to do with the reasons driving irregular migration in the region and the interface of migration and trafficking. And the second point with the reasons behind the unsuccessful effort to include and integrate distressed migrants into local societies. And I do hope that these points will give you some food for thought and some additional perspectives to consider when discussing about distressed migration in the region and inclusive solutions. But let me start from the very beginning. Migration in general is considered value neutral as a phenomenon. The circumstances of the migration journey determine whether it enhances or depresses the quality of people's lives. However, distress migration, migration that is fueled by a wide range of drivers that are perceived as intolerable, such as natural and environmental disasters, economic deprivation, persecution, or gender and social oppression, is not value neutral. It exacerbates risk because it exposes people who are already vulnerable, disempowered, or discriminated against to additional stressors and disadvantages. And this is what we observed since 2015 in the Eastern Mediterranean region. More than 1,100,000 distressed migrants entering Greece by way of Turkey, and more than 500,000 entering Italy by way of Libya. A very heterogeneous group of distressed migrants of all ages and genders, fleeing different situations, but seeking the same thing: protection and a better life. And in contrast to what public opinion believes, migration is not a new phenomenon in the region. However, the magnitude of the influx towards the region that we witnessed in 2015 was new, and it was a result of a variety of intertwined, simultaneous reasons that led thousands of migrants seeking protection at the same time, overwhelming the external borders of Europe and disproportionately affecting the countries of the region. And these reasons include the deterioration of conditions in countries of origin and transit, the geopolitical developments, and EU migration policies. But now this increased mobility came and continues to come with a cost, particularly evident in the case of distressed migrant women and children. As the mismatch between the supply of legal migration opportunities and the demand for mobility is vast, the majority of distressed migrants opt to migrate irregularly, even though they know that the Mediterranean is the world's deadliest migration route. They rely on profit-driven mobility mediators that are situated somewhere on the smuggler-trafficker continuum and most often move from one point to another during the migration journey. And as you understand, in this case, distressed migrants are pushed into situations where price rather than protection defines their prospects. And according to data, the mismatch between available legal opportunities and need for migration forced more than 90% of the distressed migrants to rely on organized criminal networks for their mobility. But now, instead of addressing this mismatch and ensuring that distressed migrants whose only options at the moment are suffering or displacement have a way to migrate regularly, European countries opted to adopt some rather superficial solutions, stricter border controls and unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral state agreements with third countries that are framed as a life-saving humanitarian endeavor and as a way of cracking down on smuggling and trafficking crime syndicates. The result? Flows to Eastern Mediterranean, as we witnessed them in 2015, were reduced, but migrants' mobility was not halted. Flows were diverted to different, more dangerous routes, went underground, and the cost of mobility was increased. Thus, the risk of exploitation of any kind became higher. And now thousands of distressed migrants are stranded in third, often unsafe countries, or countries with limited capacity to protect them. And of course, these measures have generated chaos on many countries of the region that were forced to become Europe's de facto southern border police, a situation that has serious consequences for both migrants in need and local communities. And this is the first point I want to raise. These solutions are doomed to fail because they ignore the reasons why distressed migrants flee. Stricter border controls and high walls can for sure complicate the trajectories of distressed migrants, but they do not stop them. They're just political shorthand for decisive action. They just give the impression of control over the situation, but do not resolve it with respect to human rights. And to bring up a domestic example, despite the 654-mile physical barrier between the US and Mexico, almost 1 million distressed migrants arrived at the US southern border in 2019. And the answer to the current situation is to address two of the key underlying problems. First, the factors that drive thousands to flee their home countries. And second, the lack of effective policies to manage humanitarian migration. And these problems are not easy to fix. They need time, willingness, and coordination in multiple levels. And they are certainly not the responsibility of one country or one region. But as the situation in the region illustrates, the costs of ignoring them are unsustainable in human, economic, and political terms. And given that the pandemic and the restrictions that followed have halted the limited existing vital options for mobility, while put millions of people under great financial strain, it is expected that more and more desperate migrants will seek to escape harm via shadowy and dangerous irregular pathways. And now, moving from distressed migrants who attempt to enter to those who manage to enter Europe and apply for asylum, my second point has to do with efforts of inclusion of migrants in local communities. Since the beginning of the migration crisis in Europe, inclusion and integration of asylum seekers in the countries of the region has turned into a key component of interventions. Governments introduced measures to ensure that asylum seekers have access to basic services such as school, housing, health services, and jobs. However, the inclusion and integration of migrants is hardly as straightforward as it sounds. Most of the times it is perceived as a one-way process. Migrants have to assimilate by abandoning their culture and belief systems in favor of the culture of the local population. But integration is a two-way inclusion process that depends on both the efforts of the migrant community, but also the openness, willingness, and preparation of the host community. For the process to succeed, integration should be desirable from both sides and should consider the needs of both sides. And what we witness in practice in the region is that asylum seekers lag far behind the local population across a broad swath of quality of life indicators, while the needs and concerns of the local communities are completely ignored in this process. And let's use the example of Greece to make this more clear. Since 2015, and under the pressure of the influx and that of Europe for a quick resolution of the crisis, even though the country did not have the capacity to do so, most inclusion efforts tend to focus on speed and numbers, aiming to integrate large number of migrants as fast as possible. For example, the Greek government tried to integrate 19,000 migrant children in just 1 year in the Greek public education system without preparing the local communities, students, and parents. Another example, asylum seekers were given access to public health resources without ensuring whether these resources were adequate for both migrants and locals. For example, the island of Lesbos, with a local population of 97,000 people, has one hospital with 7 ICU beds, a resource that now is being shared with additional 10,000 migrants that are stranded on the island. And in this process, the local population remains unprepared to accept the new institutional arrangements to accommodate migrant social and cultural needs. The local community, a homogeneous in terms of culture, religion, and identity community, was asked to share their space and resources with a heterogeneous group in terms of culture and religion without the needed time and preparation that such an integration requires. And what is the outcome? The local population perceives the migrant population as a threat or a problem, and efforts of integration fail. And what we are seeing in Greece is a very public transition from an open, welcoming community that exhibited unique solidarity and compassion towards the migrant population to one that now begins to show signs of hostility, xenophobia, racism, and rejection, hindering every effort of inclusion. And this is more noticeable in smaller communities with large concentration of migrants in need. And this is my second point. Integration is a two-way process that entails that both migrants and locals not just influence the process, but become an important part of it. Efforts in the region ignored the local community and did not take into account the multifaceted ways that the community's past and present history and experiences shape and drive their perceptions towards such a heterogeneous group of incomers. They ignored that in the aftermath of the recent financial crisis and austerity, migrants will be conceptualized as competitors for the existing limited public resources. They ignored that for a homogeneous nation with a long history of attacks to its freedom, culture, religion, and identity, a significantly large group of migrants with a different culture and religion may be perceived as a threat to their homogeneity without the proper preparation and time. And you know, this creates a vicious cycle. The more people feel a sense of threat or a loss of control, the more attached they become to ethnic and national identities, rejecting anything that is different. Thus, when we talk about successful inclusion and integration, we should remember that it is a relational process in which migrants and locals integrate with each other and in which history and experiences matter. And I just want to close with a reflection. The political conflicts over migration and refugees, both in the US and the Eastern Mediterranean, share a critical similarity. They aim to deter people from attempting unauthorized border crossings in the first place. And the phrase out of sight, out of mind captures their underlying political intent. And they keep renewing this intention. We are facing a crisis of humanitarian ideals, a crisis of trust and solidarity, a crisis that requires a radical departure from our current trajectory if we want to remain faithful to our core values. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Digidiki, for this informative presentation and for starting us off. And at this time, I will ask our second speaker, Dr. Ms. Voutsina, to start her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. As my colleague said, Happy New Year, and may this year be a year of peace for everyone. So I'm going to take you to the field because I'm not an academic. I wish I was a doctor, like my colleagues, but I'm a journalist and I'm also a communications professional. I work for an organization that protects unaccompanied minors. And so I'm going to share my screen with you. And I'm going to start my presentation. So I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to take you to Brussels and to Athens, where the decisions are made. And we're going to see together how Greece and the EU appear on paper to protect refugee minors. And then we will go to the ground, to the field as researchers, and we will see what's happening on the ground. So first of all, who is an unaccompanied minor? An unaccompanied minor is a child who has lost contact with his family and his or her relatives. For some reason, my PowerPoint doesn't obey. Let me go back. So in Greece, most unaccompanied refugee minors are boys, teenage boys, over 14 years old. They are fleeing poverty and instability, war and persecution. And as of December 31st, we had almost 4,000 unaccompanied minors in Greece. So I like this quote from a research paper that says, families are divided, social bonds are broken, education is disrupted, and children are called upon to make a dangerous journey on their own. I tried to imagine it for myself, and it's really, really hard to think about it. Now, let's see what are their rights. So on paper, every child is a child first and foremost, and that's because we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So many European countries, all European countries, have put in place standards and procedures to care for the survival, the development and the protection of these children. So as they say on paper, they act for the best interest of the child. And then you can see here on your screen different articles. They protect their rights for living conditions, access to healthcare, education, the right to be protected from physical, mental, sexual violence and abuse, economic exploitation, and all forms of exploitation. In the EU, the countries seek first to reunite the children with their families through the Dublin III processes. Then in the EU, the Treaty of the European Union, we have an article that promotes the protection of the rights of the child. So you can see that in many different documents, the rights of the child are protected and prioritized. So now the states are also releasing the detained unaccompanied minors from police stations or from detention centers. That's very important. So in Greece, where I'm from, and I'm living in Athens, we have a new policy with the new government. It's called No Child Alone policy. The Greek government has committed to create more shelters for unaccompanied minors, improve access to social services, and also create and reinforce the guardianship program where an adult can make decisions for an unaccompanied refugee minor. And good news are first in August, after the Moria fire, and many of you are familiar with that fire, what happened. It devastated a whole refugee camp on the island of Lesbos. 11 EU countries agreed to receive 3,300 vulnerable asylum seekers, including 1,600 children. And in November, the Greek government abolished the practice of holding unaccompanied minors in police custody, actually the cells in police stations. So according to data, public data, we have 4,000 almost unaccompanied refugee migrant children. 2,800 are living in long-term accommodation, which means apartments and shelters. And then we have other children who are living in reception centers, open facilities like refugee camps. There are 30 of them are in protective custody of the police. They are living in police stations. And almost 1,924 are living on the streets. And unfortunately, these numbers are not the real numbers, because these are the numbers, the figures are based on referrals to Greek authorities. There are many more children who are living on the streets, and they are not counted And here are some stories from the press. I'm not sure if you can read the titles, but I'll give you the description. So in 2019, a teenage boy was murdered in the Moria camp. And in 2020, a girl was raped in Karatepet camp. And of course, as you know, we have overcrowded camps in Greece. There are camps where we have 20,000 people, but they are created for 3,500 people, for example. And in those camps, kids are living as well. Oops. So let me take you to the ground, as I said, to the field, and I'll read you a few quotes from different articles. So you can feel the sound and the smell and the feeling of how it is to live as a child in Greece. The sound of Moria is raw, saw coughing from small children. The side of Moria is high fences with barbed wire rollers on top. Inside the fence are closely stacked ISO box containers, while outside the fence, tents are pitched as far as the eye can see. It is dark between the tents at night since electricity is lacking. As soon as it rains, the ground turns to mud. Clotheslines are strung between tents. Toddler-sized pants and sweaters hang from many of them. This is one quote from Solomon magazine. Then I'll read you one more. You have fled hostels in remote Greek towns so that you could sleep on the streets of Athens, where there was still money to be made. And you have had nights on the streets of Athens that left you longing for those very police cells and hostels, anywhere with a mattress and a lock on the door. So we saw what happens on paper, but now let's go to the field. There is a lack of accommodation in Greece for unaccompanied minors. Some unaccompanied minors wait a long time to get placed into hostels or shelters. And so they remain in protective custody, which means they live in police cells or detention centers until they are sent to a shelter. This can, of course, damage their mental health. And even the kids who are in a shelter, they flee because of many reasons. For example, their families pressuring them to make some money to work, or there's a lack of safety in the shelter. Some never register for asylum, and many have no idea about the reunification and relocation process in the EU. They pick work along the journey. The infamous Manolada town in northern Greece, where kids are picking up strawberries. We've read a lot of stories in the Greek media about abuse of these children. They work for 15 euros a day. They live in difficult conditions near the unofficial red light district in Athens. And now during both lockdowns we had in Greece, they cannot find work in the black market. And of course, they don't receive any support from the government. So I see 4 problems. Of course, there are more, but I tried to narrow it down to 4 problems that I would describe as a problem to integration. The first is education. Only 1/3 of all asylum-seeking children from 4 to 17 years old are enrolled in the formal education in Greece. The second problem is the asylum process. It's very slow. In one of the studies that we've done at Pharos in 2017, there is a quote that I took from there. We found out that delays in asylum, family reunification and relocation processes was an important motive for absconding from a shelter, where minors would rather take matters into their hands. So they would like to go to another European country, and they flee from a shelter and they follow informal routes to the country of their choice. By the end of August 2018, appointments for interviews for the asylum procedure were fully booked until 2020. most of these minors will have reached adulthood by the time the asylum claim is examined. That is from another study. So then these kids are becoming adults in Greece, and they have difficulty getting into the Greek workforce. A study we did in 2020 showed that the main advantage of refugee workers and migrant workers when they enter the job market is the knowledge of Greek language. And because the system is not orchestrated so refugee minors learn the Greek language, they don't have difficulties entering the workforce, and they have no way to make a living. Finally, and most importantly, is the lack of information. From observations and research, we've seen that minors do not know their rights and obligation, and they rarely receive the information in a manner and tone they can understand, and that is respectful for their age, gender, and cultural background. So, as my colleague said, Vasileia said, the integration process is a relational process. So also in the case of refugee minors, we need to approach their protection in a holistic way, which means to protect them physically, but also nurture them and educate them, give them access to official education and unofficial education that would complement the official education. Even the informal education that we have at Faros, for example, creates a sense of purpose to these children. Finally, refugee children need to be empowered in order to integrate into the society. They are the future citizens of Greece or any other European country they will travel to if they are relocated. And they can integrate better if they become an integral and equal part of any country, including Greece. Finally, I think that we have to educate the communities as well as the migrant population about each other. And we can discuss more about that. But I feel, for example, that in business, a lot of more companies need to understand the cultural differences in order to begin and hire more refugees. That would be an added value for the company. Thank you. I look forward to discussing with you all later.
Thank you, Ms. Voutsina, for your presentation. And at this time, we will go to our third speaker, Ms. Utku.
Thank you very much. As my colleagues did, I also wish you a happy new year with peace and health. Two very interesting presentations, and actually from practice where Katerina left, I'm gonna take you to a more theoretical, maybe a little bit more boring to some of you, realm. So actually if I were to, if the pandemic didn't happen, I would be able to talk about my field work that was supposed to take place over the summer and this past fall in Turkey and Greece. But unfortunately, as a lot of us, have been affected by the pandemic, my field work got canceled. So I, had more time to struggle and, grapple with some theoretical questions that you will witness right now. And I will probably leave you with even more questions than conclusions at this point. So today I want to talk about two main concepts that I think are, very critical in, in the debates regarding around migration. The notion of the concept of borders and the notion of membership to a society or citizenship, if you may. So as we all know, nation states are still the main actors of the international political system. However, a wide range of non-state actors interconnected on multiple levels subtly undermine the dominance of nation states. One of the outcomes of the globalizing world, that is the multiplying routes of migration that my colleagues have been talking about, has led to political scientists to revisit the concept of citizenship, as well as borders of nation states. So what happens, I started off with the question of, when I was starting my research, I started off with the question of what happens to the members of the state when state boundaries are challenged? Why does citizenship still matter in the age of globalization? Well, obviously, passports and government issued IDs are still crucial to travel and to gain access to certain basic services. But citizenship actually expands to beyond accessing these basic services. And which leads to another question: is human mobility a challenge to citizenship? In other words, to nation state membership. So I want to start talking about briefly about, what do we understand when we talk about borders? So borders are basically claiming political authority or sovereignty over a territory. The territorialization of the world has been actually an ancient attempt to a certain extent since the early days of human civilizations. And what has changed is how we get to define the borders of these territories. What is the source of the legitimacy of these borders? And if you think about the history of the modern state, with the emergence of the nation states, the world, starting in Europe, was divided into well-defined and established boundaries for the first time by national identities in the modern history. How these national identities were created, that can be the topic of another panel. But I would recommend, as most of you, I assume that know about Benedict Anderson imagined communities, to have a better grasp of how nation states actually emerged in the aftermath of Industrial Revolution and the introduction of print technology. Citizenship as a concept has been scholarly popular particularly since the end of 1980s. And scholars have discussed issues around post-national, supranational, transnational, and multicultural conceptions of membership. And citizenship can be defined in many different ways, and I'm not gonna get into too much details of all these theories. This is gonna be like a 2-minute crash course on theories of citizenship. But basically, a very simple definition can be a particular set of political practices involving specific public rights and duties with respect to a given political community. So some scholars have argued that it is sufficient for states to provide some sort of stable political framework to regulate social and economic life, along with various political institutions. On the other hand, some scholars have argued that citizenship entails the right to make any change within the political framework through democratic rights, such as voting, campaigning, protesting, etc. And in the literature of citizenship, we can talk about 3 major theories of citizenship that are usually named as liberal theory, communitarian theory, and the Republican theory of citizenship. Again, very briefly, the Republican theory of citizenship dates back to the early modern period in the Italian Renaissance city-states as a result of the endeavors of political figures of the time to define the notion of self-governing citizen against the domination of princes and kings. Machiavelli and Rousseau are 2 important names, and Machiavelli basically builds his discourse of citizenship within the context of a city/state based on the idea of quote-unquote order, and situations as mass migration and war would be disorder as a departure from the fundamental order. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, T.H. Marshall initiates a vivid debate on citizenship. He basically lays out 3 main elements of the development of citizenship that are civil citizenship, political citizenship, and social citizenship. So the civil element is composed of the rights necessary for individual freedom. The political element is the right to participate in the exercise of political power. And social citizenship is basically encompasses a wide range of rights broadly related to economic and social rights. And Marshall basically represents the liberal camp of the theories of citizenship, although he includes some elements of liberalized socialism that, for compared, given his days. This is like in 1950s. And finally, communitarian theory emerges as a critique to the liberal theory and focuses on the community versus individual. And citizenship is rooted in a culturally defined community. So what does all this have to do with migration? Well, scholars have been criticizing all of these theories for not being able to analyze and explain the dynamics and the effects of the global mess created by wars and the creation of new states and change of borders in other parts of the world, as well as displaced populations that you probably heard as the global refugee crisis. And most recent literature has tried to address concepts like transnational identities and transnational family networks, which we can get more into in the Q&A session, that expand beyond conventional and more local conceptions of what an identity is or what a family is. And some scholars have tried to expand citizenship to target marginalized and excluded groups, prioritizing the role of gender and race that plays into the nature of citizenship. Feminist scholars, although there's a lot of variation within the feminist camp as well, can be included in this camp, and they criticize all these major theories I just mentioned on the basis that a highly patriarchal discourse is dominant within the debates around citizenship, and that the main focus of citizenry is male. So, how does that actually look like in real life when we look at the certain issues around migration, and how we can actually try to see the issues around migration from the perspective of being a member of a community and the non-members trying to cross the borders of the nation states. A recent case we can look at is how the pandemic affected refugees and asylum seekers disproportionately compared to the citizens who are at least expected to have by default rights or have certain access to certain health services in many countries. So what happens if we've been talking about all these campaigns, stay at home, wash your hands, keep your hygiene, and what happens if your only and the most effective way of avoiding contamination and COVID-19 is staying at home and keeping up with the hygiene, but you do not have the means to do so, or you have to just keep moving, right? So this has been the case for many asylum seekers as well as refugees. And I'm gonna take a deeper look at the case of Turkey, although we don't have time to talk, about everything about pandemic and the refugees in Turkey. I just wanna give you a quick snapshot of what the situation is like. So in Turkey, the official numbers indicate that there are more than 3.7 million Syrian refugees, although the unofficial numbers are much higher. Beside asylum seekers from or irregular migrants from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, some African countries, as well as some Asian, Central Asian countries, around a little bit over 1 million who are caught and tracked by the Turkish government, and another estimated 500,000 that are not caught or tracked by the government. So one of the biggest challenges that is very hard to keep track of non-Syrian refugees or asylum seekers in Turkey, as they are legally not recognized as refugees. Why that is the case, we can talk more about later. But most of the data we rely on basically reflects the state of the Syrian refugees in Turkey. So out of 3.7 million Syrians, 1.7 million benefit the service that is named Kızılay Card, that is Red Crescent card, that is mainly funded by the EU funds. And those who are, it grants you access to certain health services. And those who are not able to use this card or need extra money for their income, extra income for their families, they choose to work informally. But in fact, most of these people have lost their jobs during the pandemic, as a lot of people did, not only asylum seekers, but also a lot of nationals lost their jobs during the pandemic, like that happened in the United States. So one reason why they lost their jobs is partially the same reason why the nationals lost their jobs. Another reason is that people have developed this xenophobia, actually, to think that the migrant workers, the refugee workers, would, quote unquote, infect them with COVID-19, and hence they no longer want to work with them. Just to give you some quick numbers, according to a survey conducted by the Association for Solidarity with Asylum Seekers and Migrants, ASAM in Turkey, unemployment among respondents, and again, these are Syrian refugees, unemployment rates before March 2020 among the respondents of the survey was 18%, and after March 2020, unemployment rates rose as much as 88%. So there's like 70% increase in unemployment. And according to the Istanbul Bar Association, as for April 2020, there have been allegations that some irregular migrants were denied health care at the hospitals, even though they showed symptoms of COVID-19, which in return can create fear among asylum seekers and refugees towards seeking treatment. On the other hand, again, Istanbul Bar Association notes that the fear among irregular migrants to seek treatment in cases of COVID-19 might be prevalent because of the possibility of getting caught by hospital officials or the police if they go to a hospital. So actually, legally speaking, according to the Director General of Migration Management in Turkey, which is the official body that deals with all the issues around migration, on paper, everybody has the right to seek urgent medical care regardless of their status. The question is, even if there are no legal barriers to seek for immediate urgent care on paper, if there are side and more severe consequences to their attempt of seeking medical treatment, like getting detained or caught, how can policymakers can make sure that everyone gets the medical response needed in a situation like in the pandemic, without having, without facing the consequences for asylum seekers and irregular migrants. Another challenge that came up during the pandemic is online on remote education in Turkey. So during the pandemic, the public education was maintained through television. So there's a specific TV channel where if you have to have a television at home, and children basically watch the channel and listen to the classes and everything. Anything other than that is made through maintained through online education, like we do here in the US. So in Turkey, out of the 700,000 refugee children who attend school, most of them were not able to effectively continue their education because they didn't have a computer or a television at home. According to the same survey that I just mentioned, 48% of these children were not able to keep up with the education, with the online or remote education, because they didn't have the means to do so. And just to give you a few last remarks, again, according to the same survey, 63% of the respondents indicated that they had issues, finding food, and 53% had issues in providing hygiene products, and majority had issues in paying for their bills and basic needs and paying for their rents. So, which is again caused by a chain of events where they lost their jobs and lost access to education and all that. So to sum up, I want to leave you with two major questions. Are borders of nation states barriers against uncontrollable human mobility, and does that also entail filter against accessing certain basic rights? And second, given the fact that nation states will be here for the foreseeable future, how can we approach or revisit the notion of citizenship that might help us better tackle with the consequences of global migration? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Utku, for your presentation. And at this time, I will ask our audience to use the Q&A box to ask questions or raise your hand feature. And I yield the floor to Dr. Prodromo, who will lead the discussion.
Okay, great. I'll turn to our questions from the viewers, but I have one general question to pose to all three of you. And first of all, I want to thank you for the kind of toward the horizon of migration as both a local and a global phenomenon. The unwieldy social science concept of glocal, combination of global and local, really comes out in your presentations. And since this is a seminar, a week-long seminar on a changing America and a dynamic Eastern Mediterranean, one of the things that was striking in all three of your proposals was the fact that there are some real similarities between the migration phenomenon north-south in the Americas and the migration phenomenon, east-west or east-west and also south-north into Europe. And these are the three similarities. And I wondered if you would all, comment on whether or not there's simply surface similarities or whether there's some depth and what that means for policy. The first is the global phenomenon of the unaccompanied minor. And we saw that in terms of, we certainly see it in Europe, but we've seen it in terms of south-north migration in the Americas and the consequences for family. But why are we seeing more and more unaccompanied minors? Is there an explanation for that in terms of migration? The second is the securitization of migration. And there we see the intersection of three features. One, identity, whether articulated in terms of race or religion. Two, violence, and whether articulated in terms of terrorism or criminality. And then three, economics, opportunity or burden. So that's the second piece, but the securitization of migration seems to draw on all three of these aspects: identity, violence, and economics. And then the third element that seems to tie the United States and the Americas with the Eastern Med is the impact and the expression of migration in terms of the pluralization of societies, and the fact that states don't seem to be doing a very good job with managing, acknowledging, and as I said, managing the pluralization of society that is the consequence of migration. So I wondered if you could, are these simply surface similarities, or are these real similarities between the Eastern Med and the US or the Americas? And is there a reason for that? And maybe we can go in terms of your order of presentation for each of you to offer a response.
Thank you, Professor Prodromo. I think that these, as I mentioned during my presentation, I think that these are critical similarities. First of all, the way we have seen that the Western world addresses migration, they just, they believe in the phrase out of sight, out of mind. We don't want to see them, and as long as we don't see them, the problem doesn't exist. And this is the reason behind externalization policies as well, that we have seen gaining a lot of popularity the past years. In terms of the number of unaccompanied minors that we see increasing in both the Mediterranean and the Caribbean basin, I believe that it is because we still have some available humanitarian options for unaccompanied minors. There are still some humanitarian visas. They still have the right to reunite with families or for a resettlement. So this is the reason why we keep seeing more unaccompanied minors coming, in the hopes that they will be able to bring later their families. Of course, what is the solution here? We should prevent minors from coming to the countries. No, this is why we need to invest more in humanitarian migration options, and of course in resolving the situations that cause distress migration.
Great, thank you. Anything on the securitization or the pluralization piece of that?
I think that perhaps I would like to address this and provide a response to the first question that one of the attendees asked. So what we have seen in fact, I think that this is a very important question. The challenge that we face in the islands at the moment is not only that we have a heterogeneous group, it is also that we have a rather large number of migrants for the sizes of the islands. A large number of migrants that live in perilous conditions, in camps, for a prolonged period of time. The condition we thought on the island of Lesbos that what was happening was a temporary situation, but the Moria camp lasted for 5 years. And now the field that hosts the new camp, the Moria 2, as it is called now, is being run for another 5 years. So what locals see is that the situation is not temporary. It starts becoming permanent. So even though at the very beginning, they don't necessarily have a problem with the diversity of the migrants, but rather than with policies that keep them on the island, slowly we see that they start having problems with the numbers of migrants and with the characteristics of migrants. And in the question, to address the question, I don't know whether this will lead to an increased popularity for the far-right political parties, but I can say for sure that, so I don't know if people will vote for far-right political parties, but for sure they have started endorsing their perceptions and their opinions. We saw this here in Lesbos. People who welcomed migrants and people who opened their homes 5 years ago, now they opposed any effort for relocation in a better camp. They opposed every effort for better conditions inside the camps. It's not necessarily that they want to go against the migrants, but it is a way to say no to the current situation. If this situation continues, then differences in culture, in religion, issues of security will start becoming more intense.
All right, great. I think, again, the idea of wickedness emerges here insofar as there's no real beginning, there's no real ending. This is the reality of global human movement. And so how to manage this in a humane way becomes the centerpiece. Katerina or Ahsen, either of you, would you like to follow?
Thank you, Vaso, for setting up the stage for this. But I think I agree with everything you said, and I can only add a few more, details from the ground. One reason why we see a lot of unaccompanied minors in Greece is because there is still tension in their home countries, and that's something that we shouldn't turn a blind eye to that. A lot of stories from kids, children who are at Faros are about bombs and terrorism, and it's still happening. It's not only COVID-19. These are long crises that have not ended. Then Vasileia talked also about how kids are the first person in a family to bring their family to Europe or to the US. And that's absolutely true. Especially in Greece, we have boys from Afghanistan who have one mission, life mission, to bring their family to Europe in 5 years or when they find a job. That's why unaccompanied minors leave the shelters and they sleep on the streets and make money from prostitution, drugs, etc. It's a long story. Yes, and on the part of integration and the pluralization of the society, I think this is something that in an organization that protects refugee minors, we also learn to teach other people. And at this point, I know Vaso is absolutely right that we are not there yet, but we are trying to teach the society and around minors, their educators, their teachers, their doctors, and their future employers, to receive them as an equal member of the society. And I think if we want to move to a more integrated, to a more pluralized society, that's the way to go. And so slowly we're trying to educate them, to receive them.
Ahsen, would you like to follow up too? And I just want to add one thing based on what both Vasu and Katerina have said, and it speaks to one of the questions as well. Does both of you have emphasized the numbers, the sheer scale of people on the move? Does that have any impact or any relevance when it comes to actual absorption location in country? Someone asked about in Greece whether moving migrants and asylum seekers from Lesbos to the mainland would matter. And I would ask the same question for you, Ahsen, in terms of Turkey. Does it matter? I mean, given the enormous numbers that Turkey has absorbed, do you see any difference in terms of absorption and integration when it comes to location?
Thank you very much. And I actually do agree with everything my colleagues have said. I just want to add a couple of more points in terms of why, there are more unaccompanied minors increasing. I think it also has to do with the new patterns of resilience, I would say, developed by especially families who are trying to adapt to increasing security measures against, migration. And when I was talking about, transnational family networks, I was kind of actually referring to the fact that it has come, as a result of the severe conditions in the homelands of these children. It could be war or poverty, persecution, some, disaster. In cases where it is almost impossible or very challenging for the family to migrate together, it has become more favorable, although not ideal, obviously, more favorable to usually send off the boys to, get out of the situation and create a kind of a more, I would say, flexible network and relationships outside, both with the family and outside the family. So I think it's a response developed by the families to the who are stuck between the hardship that they are in versus increased security measures. In terms of the second part of your question, and I'm going to come back to the perception of the local depending on where they are, and there's actually another question in the chat box after this. In terms of pluralization and securitization of migration, I'm going to again approach this from the citizenship perspective. So I think it's, there's, of course, I do agree there's a lot to be done in terms of educating the locals and educating the whole societies and integrating the incoming populations, but it's also on the side of the states. So in creating the perception of who makes a better citizen. States actually continuously revisit their notions of citizenship. They continuously update their who makes an acceptable citizen. I'm not only talking about the citizenship criteria that you would see on paper if you're going to apply for the citizenship. I'm actually talking about more identity issues that states usually see as the better citizen, an acceptable citizen, and those who are to be included in the society as compared to those who are going to be marginalized or pushed to the margins in the society. So I think this has a lot to do with the states kind of revisiting and refreshing their notions of who makes a better citizen, and that kind of I think that also shapes the society's perception of, okay, who, some of us are better than others, so what makes us better than the others? I mean, this can be applied in many cases. Speaking in Turkey, in the Turkish case, it can be a lot of cases in the United States. You're also gonna see, like, looking at the history, you're gonna see, waves of different groups, different populations who have been excluded from this good citizen, quote unquote, good citizen category in the past. But that has changed. So in terms of how the society perceives, to be honest, I don't have an exact, I don't have the data on top of my head that would give you an exact, an accurate picture. I would say, I mean, it's usually the bigger cities where the asylum seekers and refugees are gathered, obviously, because there's a lot, usually more job opportunities. How does that, I mean, I think there needs to be more ethnographic work to prove my point. But I think there's based on my observation on the reaction by the Turkish society, I think there's an expectation of if you are a refugee or if you are an asylum seeker, what have you, you have to be content with what you are given and not ask for more. So there's that kind of expectation when you get to reach better living standards. That's kind of something that the rest of the society and the Turkish nationals might be getting upset at, and that would usually happen, I would say, in the bigger cities. There's actually another question that I related to that. Does the differentiation between being a migrant or refugee affect public opinion? I don't think to be honest, I don't think the local, at least speaking of Turkey, people are educated in that sense. I don't think they make any scientific differentiation between who's a migrant and who's a refugee. And unfortunately, in many cases, they act more on, the false information disseminated on the internet rather than the scientific differentiations and what kind of services actually these people have access to and whatnot. So yeah.
Can I pivot off of that? And that's in the chat box as well. In the case of Greece, does that term migrant versus refugee, is the valence any different? And I go back to Vasu, some of the work that we did on Lesbos, and Katerina as well in the information networks. You both emphasize that history and context matter. And does refugee have a more positive connotation than does migrant? And even in the US, we could generalize that, but certainly in the case of Greece. Can you say a little bit more about how language, if it matters or doesn't matter?
Well, yes, it does matter. We saw it during our study, but we have seen it more and more now, particularly after the 2019 and 2020 and the destruction of Moria, because in fact people in Lesbos thought that the destruction of Moria would signal the end of the crisis on the island, but then they realized that this is a situation that will continue for a long time. I just want to say that it does play a huge role, because at the moment the way migrants come to Greece, it puts them in a situation they are being conceptualized as illegal migrants. You violated the borders, you came illegally, therefore you shouldn't be here. Now, when you get the status of a refugee, then this perception changes, because they start realizing that, oh, you have reasons for seeking protection. Therefore, I should accept you, or at least I should start accepting you into the society. But everyone else, starting with migrants who haven't applied for asylum yet, and for asylum seekers who haven't been determined as and recognized as refugees yet, they're being seen as illegal migrants. Therefore, they shouldn't be accepted into the society. And you know, everything has to do with perceptions. And I want to go back to my previous response. We saw after the so-called migration crisis on the Greek islands, we saw a decrease in the numbers of tourists coming to the islands. Now, someone can claim that this has nothing to do with migrants, that this was, there were multiple other reasons why we saw this decrease. But if locals believe that it is the migration crisis that caused this decrease, it becomes their reality, and the perceptions will shape their behavior, and it will prevent the integration of asylum seekers, because on the island we still have asylum seekers, we don't have refugees yet. So yes, the differentiation does matter because it shapes perceptions and then behaviors.
Katerina, can I ask you to follow up on that? And particularly, given that you're a journalist, I would like to ask you to say a little bit about the responsibility of the media in the language that is used, and in as a, you know, an institution, or, you know, a set of networks that bears a responsibility when it comes to educating arrivals and locals. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I would like to be more optimistic and say that media can educate and promote and describe and educate. But no, the answer is no. Unfortunately, even though we had a volume of articles about refugees and migrants, and even us journalists, we were debating whether we should call them refugees or migrants. And I know on the street, like if you were asking somebody, they will say, oh, us refugees. So even the refugees who were crossing through Athens or through Lesbos or through Idomeni in the northern Greece, the border between Greece and the Balkan route, they were saying, of course, we are refugees. So you were debating with colleagues which word you should use. But even though there was a volume of articles about the refugee crisis, I don't think that the perceptions have changed. And I like that Dr. Digidiki is from Lesbos, and she can describe more the tension between the locals and refugees sometimes. But the view from Athens is not very, very different. Lesbos is a smaller place. Athens is the biggest city. And yet people are not very familiar with who is a refugee, who is a migrant, why they are here, what they are going to do next. So no, the answer is no. I don't think that we educated anybody. Of course, there is room for education, and thankfully, since 2015, there are a few independent media organizations like Solomon Magazine, for example, that were created on the premise that, you know, if we become creators, if refugees become creators and journalists, creators of content and journalists, they can also educate by describing firsthand what it is to be a refugee. Now, you mentioned about the word and the burden it bears, the refugee. In Greece, we are a country, we have refugees, Greek refugees, who came to Greece in 1922. And in the beginning of the crisis, and Vaso can add, especially on Lesbos, an island where refugees settled from Asia Minor, the sentiment was all about helping and caring for the other, in quotes. So, yeah, I hope I answered your question.
No, absolutely, yeah.
I am hopeful that this kind of small media that were created within the crisis will become the lighthouse for other media to tell the stories in a better way.
Yeah, Vaso, do you want to pick up on that from the project? Yeah.
Well, if I'm allowed to add an example from a different area, that of sexual exploitation and human trafficking, but I feel that I want to share this example to show how strong public perceptions are and how they drive our behavior and why we need education so much. We all know the phenomenon of human trafficking, and perhaps all the attendees here have heard about the sexual exploitation of migrant children that is taking place not just in Greece, but also in many other countries, as a way of survival. So in 2015, when I was conducting the study in Athens, and we could see in broad daylight children being exploited, when you were bringing this up to citizens, but also to policymakers or even to journalists, and we were talking about the exploitation of children, you were not hearing the word victims. You were hearing the word sex workers. And we were talking about children, victims of human trafficking. And this perception that a child is a sex worker, therefore it has a desire for what is happening, there is a willingness to do it, remove the victimization and place them in a position where they're not victims anymore, but they're the perpetrators of the situation. And this drove the behavior of many citizens or even many members of the police, because they could have helped the situation, or it could at least prevent the exploitation of one or two children, and they didn't. So it shows to us that the public perceptions do matter, and we need to do something to change this. And I want to pick up to one of the questions. I know that we don't have much time, but I think that I would like to mention this, is a question about the that migration will continue because more and more factors will lead to distress migration. There are a lot of perceptions now that if we are able to educate migrants before they leave the countries, we will be able to prevent migration, irregular migration, and therefore we will be able to prevent also smuggling and trafficking and the exploitation that is taking place en route. I want to mention here a study that took place 2 years ago from UNICEF that showed that even though migrants, and particularly children, were fully aware of the exploitation that would experience en route, they still decided to embark on the journey. And in fact, they were taking measures to prevent specific risks. For example, they were taking contraceptive measures to prevent rape that would take place en route instead of avoiding the journey altogether. So it shows to us that distress migration will continue as long as reasons exist. So we need to start educating the populations in destination and in transit countries. We need to understand that this phenomenon will continue for the same or new reasons. And we need to find ways to integrate these distressed people in our societies in the best way possible, of course, acknowledging the unique factors of the local populations as well.
Thank you to all of you. I know we're tight on time, but I want to address this question because it's appeared a couple of times in the chat, and I think we've been given permission to go over for a couple of minutes. So I wanted to ask all of you about the linkages between, and Ahsen, I think this comes up very clearly in your presentation, and ideas about citizenship and borders, external in terms of territory, but internal in terms of diversity and belonging or otherness. I wanted to ask you all to comment a little bit about the linkage between the migration phenomenon and its political consequences, and in particular, the rise of populist discourse, populist leaders, and exclusionary politics, whether we call that right-wing exclusionary of the right or exclusionary of the left, but politics of otherness. Could each of you just say a comment on that in the final remaining time? I'm looking at my screen, so I'm going from who I see first to who I see last. So I'll start with Katerina, go to Vasu, and end with Ahsen.
Yeah, Greece is an example, but not a good one. Thankfully, not a good one. We had the rise of Golden Dawn. We saw a few incidents and of violation of private space and violence in general. But Golden Dawn is in the past, and thankfully it's nothing that could be used as an example. The incidents were few about the polarization in politics. I think we have better examples in other countries where we saw since 2016 the closing of their borders, and Greece is impacted by the closing of the borders. So I'm talking more on a more pan-European level. But I think your question was about Greece. In Greece, even though we've seen actions that are, I'm not proud of, whatever I read at that point of Golden Dawn, I don't think that there is a huge polarization. I don't know, Baso, maybe in a smaller place, people are more polarized, and that's normal. But in Athens, I haven't observed or written about something like that.
Okay, Vaso, and would you agree that about the depth or the superficiality of the social rootedness of a group like Golden Dawn and or other political party manifestations?
I believe that the way we handle migration crisis in the region, and specifically in countries like Greece that have been tasked to literally handle the migration crisis, can lead to xenophobic beliefs that occasionally can lead to far-right beliefs. Now, as I mentioned before, I don't know if people will decide to vote for far-right parties, but for sure they will start endorsing this kind of opinions. And we have seen it happening for the past 2 years in places like the Greek islands, because as Katerina mentioned, smaller places with a larger concentration of migrants, they see the problems and they see the impact on their realities, everyday life, their normal life, the life that they knew. So we have seen it, as I mentioned, that people who in fact swam into the sea to help people now opt for closed camps. They opt for detention centers. They say the more we don't see them, the better. We don't want them here. They try to push for local governments, and then the local governments will push the government to send them, to relocate them to mainland Greece. We start seeing more and more beliefs that go against migrants, and slowly we start seeing factors like securitization. We have started seeing factors like religion coming up, something that it was not the case in 2015. So more and more people now start seeing the differences between locals and migrants, something that it was not obvious before. And the more this situation will continue without substantial measures to resolve the situation, the more we will see a polarization of the opinion. I want to mention something very important. These a change of perceptions towards migrants hasn't led yet to any kind of violence. In fact, in February and March 2020, when we saw the riots in Greece, in Lesbos, excuse me, we saw migrants and locals demonstrating together. The question is, until when? We don't know if this situation and the lack of efficient solutions will not prevent violence in the future, but the polarization exists.
All right, okay. We'll close with Ahsen. How about a view from Turkey or a view from Boston, Massachusetts, since that's where some of us are sitting.
Yeah, so the Turkish case is a little bit different than in terms of how populism works actually. So the government, known actually for its populist policies, is not anti-immigration. The anti-immigrant policies are actually mostly advocated by the main oppositional party, which is, I would categorize as more of a leftist nationalist party. And and the welcoming feelings that were prevalent in, like in the case of Greece in the early times of the the migration flows, especially from Syria, was kind of, speaking of religion at the very beginning, was kind of tolerated because, oh, we are all, we're all members of the same religion. It's like a brotherhood of Muslimhood and everything. I'm not talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, general, like this, the solidarity, which actually disappeared very soon, as it seemed that they were to stay in Turkey for a very long time, and more people, continued coming in, which combined also with the hatred and racism against Arabs that can be traced back to, I would say, the First World War, and maybe even back, in history. So it kind of all combined with the fact that regardless their status, regardless whether they're an asylum seeker, whether they are refugees, it doesn't really matter as long as they're speaking a different language and they come from a different ethnicity, which is even more complicated if the refugee is actually, a Kurdish refugee or from a different religion, it even complicates more. So it's the populist politics work a little bit different than in the context of Greece, but it's definitely an issue, and it has to be worked together. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. And I think it's, again, going back to the notion of citizenship and how to build the notion of, how to revisit the notion of citizenship and what makes a good citizenship in the eyes of the society and the state. I think that's a very long-term project that, state and the society has to work together.
All right, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Natalie now, but I want to thank all three of you. It's a pleasure to work with you, and also a pleasure to hear you. And thank you for sort of giving us a window into the meaning, the complexity that is encapsulated in the term wickedness, and your emphasis on the importance of sort of thinking in short, medium, and long term, your emphasis on history, and also getting us to think in holistic terms about multi-stakeholder analysis and multi-stakeholder solutions. So we'll look forward to the day when you all are in policy-making positions, because right now there seems to be a short shrift of the kind of nuanced thinking that you all presented. So thank you for being with us and closing out the day, and I turn it back to Natalie.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, so I'd like to thank all of our speakers today, Dr. Digidiki, Ms. Voutsina, and Ms. Utku. We are very grateful for this interesting and insightful presentations and discussion. I'd like to also thank our facilitator, Dr. Prodromo, for leading this great discussion, and thank our audience as well for being here and for asking these great questions. Before ending the presentation, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be having another presentation tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. Ambassador Ramaviram and Dr. Tsapos will be presenting on energy and climate change in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I would like to thank again everyone for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.